this on our YouTube and website, so that if you would like to share the link with a friend who was unable to attend, please feel free to do that once we have placed these up on our website. I am honored today to introduce Bill Plante for tonight's program. Bill is a veteran journalist, and he has covered many key moments in American history. He's been on the front lines of pivotal times and life-changing times in our society. Bill covered the 65 voting rights marches from Selma to Montgomery, and was a national correspondent for CBS News. You might have seen Bill recently on the news, as he was part of the anniversary celebrations and interviewed for that as well. In addition to the important civil rights moments, Bill had many tours of duty in South Vietnam, reporting on the Vietnam War. His last tour was in '75 during the fall of Saigon. Again, a pivotal time in American history. Following that, Bill served as the senior White House correspondent for CBS, and he was a regular on CBS This Morning and CBS Evening News. After his long and distinguished career, Bill retired in 2016. Since retirement, he's kept busy as an active grandparent. He has 8 grandchildren and regularly enjoys traveling with them. I know Bill told me when he was taking the grandchildren to Selma that was something special for them. Bill's also been an active member of Georgetown Village. Bill and his wife, Robin, are founding members of the village. And Bill has been a board member as well, serving as a co-chair for our communications committee. As a co-chair, Bill has provided invaluable assistance in terms of our publicity and marketing pieces. As you can tell, I'm a huge fan, and I want to personally thank Bill for agreeing to lead this program for our community. We are very lucky to have him and Robin as members of our village, and we thank you for joining us for tonight's program. Again, there will be time at the end of the program for you to ask questions. We will allow you to unmute yourself, or if you prefer, if you'd like to type your question into the Q&A, I will ask the questions for you. Bill, thank you again, and the room is yours.
Well, Lynn, thank you for the introduction, which I really was much more than I deserved. So, thank you. I know it's going to be a busy night for those of you who are watching the Democrats, but on the other hand, Hillary Clinton doesn't speak till after 9, and Kamala Harris and Barack Obama don't come on until after 10, so we'll be well out of your hair. So in the meantime, settle in with your cocktails. And what could be more appropriate on a political evening than a discussion of fake news? Humor columnist Gene Weingarten, you've probably seen his work in the Post, years ago, once wrote, "Imagine how many more newspapers we could sell if our headlines didn't have to be true." Well, little did he know, he was ahead of his time. He was onto the idea of clickbait, internet headlines which are written to let you open the story, to get you to open the story. I often think about how much has changed during my working life. When I started to cover the White House at the beginning of the Reagan administration in 1981, news every night at 6:30 on CBS, NBC, and ABC was pretty much what we said it was. Viewers had few other options. When I first started in this business, we took ourselves very seriously. Major news organizations, including the networks, believed that we had a responsibility to tell people what they needed to know. And there was no one with any real influence, any real reach to say otherwise. When Ed Murrow reported from a rooftop in London during the Blitz, when a young David Brigley told the nation that FDR had died in Warm Springs, when Walter Cronkite announced that JFK was dead in Dallas, they spoke to a nation that was united in war or fear of it, and which trusted the source of its news. It's my cocktail. But today, people suit their news to their convictions. The need for carefully sourced and reported news is greater than ever because of that. News comes to us in a cacophony of voices from everywhere: radio, television, newspapers, the internet, Twitter, Facebook. It's a continuing mashup of fact and opinion, which makes it very difficult to know what is true and what is not. President Trump tweeted, "The fake news media is the enemy of the American people." Now, there's a sentiment which you don't normally hear in democracies. But press bashing and hating the news as a political weapon are not new to the Trump administration. I got news for you, real news. The press has been a thorn in the side of presidents and politicians since the founding of the Republic. In the colonies and the early years of the nation, the press consisted of a wide variety of very, very partisan newspapers, usually devoted to the promotion of one politician over others, and usually vicious in their treatment of enemies. The press was the internet of its time back then, full of lies and slander and character assassination. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson was accused in one paper of, quote, running a Congo harem, unquote, in Monticello. John Adams was accused of smuggling in British prostitutes to serve his perverted desires. Talk about fake news. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, but in 1798, the new First Amendment did not stop the Adams administration from passing the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act allowed the president to get rid of any foreigners that he didn't want in the country. The Sedition Act outlawed false statements about government. Sound familiar? Do I hear fake news? Remember, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does rhyme sometimes. Thomas Jefferson campaigned against the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he pardoned those who were still serving when he took office as president in 1801. But his biographer says that before the acts expired, he prosecuted several of his own critics under the Sedition Act. And the list keeps going on. I mean, when Abraham Lincoln was a young, rising politician, he wrote letters to the editor criticizing his opponents over fake names. And they, of course, got published. The idea of holding news to objective facts rather than the politics of the newspaper's owner didn't really take effect until early in the 20th century. Of course, that never stops politicians from putting their own spin on things. FDR was quick to understand the reach of radio and his fireside chats. Anyway, fake news isn't really new. But here's the difference. Nowadays, it spreads with the speed of light. After he won in 1980, Ronald Reagan's image maker, Mike Deaver, said to me, we're going to go over your heads. We're going to go directly to the American people. That wasn't so easy then. There were only 3 networks and the 3 wire services, and the news budget of every given day was pretty much what they decided it was. But fast forward to the era of social media when anyone's idle musings can be flashed around the world in just seconds. So when the President of the United States says to a group of reporters, quote, it's frankly disgusting the way the press is able to write whatever they want, people should look into it, unquote. Or when he tweets, quote, why do we work so hard in working with the media when it is corrupt? Take away credentials? That matters. It's this president's method of operation. My colleague Leslie Stahl tells the story. This happened when she was interviewing Mr. Trump a few days after his election. She told me he started, this is before the interview, he started to attack the press. So I said to him, she said, why do you keep on hammering at this? You've won. And he said to me, said Leslie, you know why I do it? I do it to discredit you all and to mean you all, so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you, unquote. The morning following the actual interview, the executive producer of 60 Minutes got a phone call from Mr. Trump who said, "How do we do in the ratings?" And he was told we did very well, 14 million people. He then turned away and announced to the people who were in the room with him, "We got 30 million. The ability to communicate on Twitter has given this president a platform like no other, and he has used it to spread misinformation and lies. The Washington Post's fact checker counts 20,000 lies or misstatements from the beginning of his presidency until mid-July this year. Many of the lies are repeated over and over. The size of the inauguration crowd. COVID will simply just go away. Mail-in voting equals widespread fraud. The economy is the best in history. The wall is being built. He regularly distorts, inflates, and lies. His one-time National Security Advisor, John Bolton, claims in his book that the president railed against reporters saying that we should be jailed unless we reveal our sources. He said, "These people should be executed, they're scumbags." Lots of people have thought that. Presidents don't usually say it. Anything he doesn't like is fake news. By making reporters and news organizations the enemy, he encourages the deterioration of trust in news reporting, and he, by example, legitimizes the kinds of tactics that are used by autocrats in other countries, putting journalists in danger in places like the Philippines and Turkey, to name just a few of the countries whose leaders have denounced as fake news any inconvenient fact that they don't like. The World Press Freedom Index notes that reporters covering President Trump are routinely abused by his crowds with his encouragement, to the point where they sometimes require private security to do their jobs. More seriously, the attitude he projects can even inspire people to use deadly force, as we saw when a gunman shot up the offices of the Capital Gazette in Annapolis 2 years ago. And many people will believe what the president tweets. The most recent Night Gallup poll of attitudes toward the press finds that the majority believe inaccurate news to be intentional, whether it's because the reporter is either misrepresenting the facts or because the reporter, he or she, is making them up entirely. People believe that. One of the dangers, of course, of being a reporter in Washington is groupthink. Reporters here are mostly well-educated, well-paid people covering a government which is supposed to be run according to all of the rule books for the benefit of the people. Well, as a matter of fact, most of these professionals simply don't understand the power, pardon me, of the populist message that Mr. Trump sends to America. And that's because most of us are pretty far removed from the circumstances of a lot of people who like what he says. And worse yet, the latest survey from Night Gallup shows that a vast majority of Americans perceive inaccurate news to be intentional, a charge that the president makes frequently. The internet and social media have changed the way reporters do their jobs, and they have seduced reporters, some of them, into a sort of self-referential popularity contest of tweets and likes on Facebook. They become celebrities and they sometimes comment as opposed to reporting. This is terrible for what we are supposed to be doing, because it automatically disposes readers or viewers not to trust that person. So reporting and commentary are often confused, especially on cable TV. People don't make the distinction, and we don't help them to do it. Are the people you see on a panel of cable news, are they reporters? Or are they people who are there, invited there or paid to offer their opinion. Reporters don't do themselves any favors when they give in and do a snarky post on Facebook. Okay, so what should we be doing? Paying more attention to the people who have responded to the president's message would be one place to start. The people who have felt the effects of deindustrialization, jobs shipped overseas, unfair trade agreements, and insecure borders, and who have felt the failure of politicians to help them. The answer to fake news is inevitably more news, real news. The craziness can't be allowed to become the new normal. But the danger is that the reality becomes the new normal. As a result, we have whole swaths of the country that regard the coronavirus as something that's overhyped or even made up, who regard the mask requirement as an infringement on their rights as citizens. That is, until it hits where they live. And there's worse news, sorry to tell you. Fake news is only the beginning of the information credibility problem. There's now a major debate about the whole idea of objectivity in news coverage. Can objectivity even exist? It's been the ideal in news coverage for a century or so. But is there such a thing? We are all, after all, the product of our own upbringing and belief systems, of our parents and schooling. But does that mean that we see the world according to our own prejudices and beliefs? Am I able, as an 82-year-old white Catholic American, to see the world in the same way as a 25-year-old Black woman or a 40-year-old Native American man? For years, the answer to that in journalism has been the all sides rule. It's also known as he says, she says. That worked when it was the only game in town. But now that everyone's point of view is immediately available on social media, should mine still be the gold standard? So this has created a new and different kind of problem in news organizations. Perhaps you've noted, as I have, that there seems to be a lot more opinion in news columns these days, as opposed to the editorial columns. Does it make you uncomfortable? Does me. You may recall that a month or so ago, a woman named Barry Weiss, who was writing a column for the New York Times, resigned from the paper, saying, quote, "Truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else." She was criticizing her mostly young peers at the Times. Now, I still feel the truth can be discovered incrementally, and maybe not easily, but in fact it can. So be fair, tell the truth. But here's another one. Should the entire burden then be on you, the reader, viewer, or listener, to figure out where the truth lies? Do you deserve some protection in law or regulation? Facebook and Google and Amazon have been wrestling with and against regulation for years. Their business models depend on selling your consumer information, so they are reluctant to really impede that in any way. And discerning the truth continues to become more difficult. It's become very easily now to manipulate video. One example is the clip recently which showed Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, slurring her words, appearing to be drunk. The video had been edited and then slowed down in playback to create that appearance. Another example was a video which seemed to show a woman, a CNN reporter, attacking an intern in the White House newsroom during a news conference. In fact, the president had just criticized the reporter and the intern was trying to get the mic from him, but the video was manipulated. But way more alarming than that is the technology which now allows us to put words into people's mouths and make people appear to be saying things they are not, real people saying whatever you want to make them say. These are called deep fakes, and they have real potential to cause chaos. It's possible to make a video showing someone speaking words that they never said. Senator Marco Rubio suggested that a convincing deep fake could undermine elections, throw our country into tremendous crisis internally, and weaken us externally. And that's true. We live in a time of political and economic polarization. Each side has its own narrative, its own worldview, and its own facts. It's the own facts part that troubles me most. Human beings seek out information that supports what they want to believe, and they ignore the rest. Hacking that human tendency gives malicious actors a lot of power. So what to do? One place is to begin educating middle school students about history, civics, and media literacy. A Stanford education study looked at both poor urban school districts and well-off suburban ones, and it found out that there's no reason to believe that just because children seem to know all about technology, that they have learned any critical skills. 80% of the middle schoolers they studied could not distinguish news from ads labeled sponsored content. Same thing when high school students were shown a photo of weird-looking double-headed daisies, which were allegedly the result of a nuclear accident. Only 20% of them questioned the lack of information about the picture and its provenance. So when all is said and done, the burden of sorting out the real from the fake news really rests on each one of us. Probably not what you wanted to hear. But don't accept the news that you see at face value. Be critical, particularly if it seems in any way questionable. Be skeptical. There was a legendary editor at the City News Bureau of Chicago years ago who used to tell young reporters, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Use some of the tools that exist to help you determine what's true and what's not. There's an internet site, for example, called Snopes.com. Snopes is named after some of the most twisted characters in William Faulkner's writing. And it debunks or confirms material that's on the net. There's another site called NewsGuard that rates internet pages according to their record of accuracy and general trustworthiness. It is subscription-based at $2.95 a month. But even just looking for confirmation of something suspicious on a few different sites may help sort things out. And it helps if each of us can be aware of our own biases. Approaching this understanding that putting together a news story involves deciding what to put in and what to leave out. So some will prefer the emphasis of the New York Times. Others will prefer the emphasis of the Washington Times. So again, bring a critical eye. It is often said that we are a nation of individualists. Fine. Interpret the world as you wish, but do it with your eyes and your minds open. Make the effort to dig out the facts and support the journalism that helps you do it. I look forward to discussing this. Apologize for my rocky voice, but we'll carry on here. So Lynn, I'm going to turn it back to you and go here to audience view.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you very much. This is very interesting. I am a user of Snopes.com, and I do check things out. I welcome questions, and so what I'm going to do is see, I put everybody on speaker, on gallery view. If you have a question, please raise your hand or do it electronically, put something in the chat. Bill is happy to answer questions, and there's a lot to discuss here. So I truly hope that we will, be able to start a discussion. That was our hope. It wasn't just to find out what Bill knows, but to see what questions you might have and how we can answer them. So let's see, I don't see any questions. Am I missing anybody here? Okay, actually, I'm going to ask Emily to unmute. I see Emily Summers, one of our members, has a question. And Nelly, I'm going to ask you next. Okay.
Bill, thank you very much for a very, very informative and interesting talk. One of the questions I had is whether you think it would be useful for schools to begin to teach courses that would in some way enable students to be more discerning about how to read the news, how to separate fact from fiction, what sources to look at, and how to think more analytically about what's accurate and what isn't.
Well, the answer to that is absolutely. I think I alluded to it in my talk, but there are courses now in media literacy, usually in middle school. They're not universal. They should be. Kids should understand that something is true, not because I, the reporter, said so, but because I've attributed it to a source. If another person who said it, or a place where it appears in print. In other words, find out where this is coming from. Don't just take my word for it. So yeah, media literacy is very important. And really, I think it should be taught everywhere.
Thank you. Nellie, I was going to, yes.
Okay. Bill, would you talk about bias in a newspaper? You mentioned emphasis. I'm thinking of bias. I dearly love the Washington Post and read it daily, but it is definitely biased against Trump. And I have friends who have actually started reading the New York Times in place of the Washington Post because they feel that the Post is overly biased. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, that's interesting, only because if your friends have gone to the New York Times and they don't like Trump, and they do like Trump, they're in the wrong place.
Right.
It seems to me that the Times is even more anti-Trump than the Post. But this goes to the problem that I mentioned, where opinion slides more and more into news columns. It's particularly commentary. You can report what somebody said, what a politician said, but if you then begin to interpret what that means, you run into the danger of interjecting your own biases and opinions.
Yes.
And I agree with you that the Post demonstrates an attitude that is mostly against Mr. Trump.
Absolutely.
So of course does the Times, in my view. And what I don't like is seeing, and they're mostly younger reporters, who mix what I consider opinion with fact. So it'd be interesting to see what your friends think after they read the Times for a while.
Okay.
Okay, Bill, I have one here on the chat box. It says it's from Nancy. Many commentators have argued that Facebook, Twitter, and the like have a responsibility to filter fake news and posts that encourage violence, discrimination, etc. Are you concerned that the pendulum might swing too far and these sites then become censors of views as opposed to those platforms?
Well, yes, of course. Look, when it comes to censorship, I'm pretty much against, but you have to decide where the limits are. It's the old fire in a crowded theater argument. You have to decide when there are lines that can't be crossed. This is very difficult. Facebook and Twitter don't want to do it. Facebook has adopted, and Twitter both have adopted some regulations, and they've given in to labeling some things as untrue. But they, for both commercial and freedom of speech reasons, they don't want to do it. So it's an area that has to be very closely guarded. I agree.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Bill? I know, okay, I see. Okay, looks like Andrea, do you have a question or is it question. I'm not sure who's asking, but if you would unmute, let me see if I can, there you go.
One of the, can you hear me?
We can, thank you, Jim.
One of the things that I've noticed that print journalists have tried to do is to write columns that they say are analysis more than just reporting, which is somewhere between factual reporting, analysis, and op-ed opinion. Do you think that's a dangerous, slippery slope?
It can be, yes. I think, Jim, that analysis is good, but you really have to be careful that you don't go too far in the direction of opinion. I mean, and what you analyze in a given situation may not be what someone else thinks, and therefore that the other person perceiving it may see opinion. But generally speaking, I do think that the analysis columns can be helpful. You just have to, again, approach them with your eyes wide open and say, well, I agree, I don't agree, or the writer missed this, didn't take that into account, missed this fact. It puts the burden on us, but it can be helpful, I think. So yeah, your point's well taken.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, I see Sally. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Bill. That was a good presentation. Just kind of picking up on your comment that we all bring bias to whatever it is. I'm curious as to how prospective hires in a newsroom, reporters are screened for those bias. And in fact, I mean, you would certainly eliminate cable news from that, but in places like the Washington Post or the New York Times or other organizations or magazines, what have you, how do they interview to be sure that they have someone that either represents their point of view or is neutral or has, has any prejudices they bring to their stories or their reporting?
Good question. When a reporter is hired by a major daily like the Post, he or she generally has been to journalism school and has presumably learned what the road rules of journalism are and what it means to be fair and honest in your reporting. But one thing I alluded to in the talk is that younger reporters, particularly in some places like the Times, there was that kerfluffle over the woman who resigned as an op-ed writer, tend to believe that there are certain things that, certain lines that can't be crossed. There are certain things you can't say or do. And that, I think, is wrong. You have to be able to explain what you're doing, explain why you're doing it. Your biases, on the other hand, should never come out. Should never come out in front of everything else. Depends again on your bias. You are who you are. You're taken by all of your background. Got to be set aside. Say, well, these are the facts I know. So here's what I've done. Anyway, by the time they get to big leagues, most people have had journalism training. Presumably, no. And they also will have a thick a manual of style and facts to read and standards. Every news organization now that I know has a big book of standards that you have to read and promise to abide by. So that's another way.
We have a number of questions and comments in the chat that I'd like to share with Bill. The first one is, there are some folks who think the mainstream media has been complicit in its own denigration by treating every tweet like a major policy pronouncement, and by essentially giving the president double press coverage by both printing his tweets on the screen and reading the tweet out loud. And yet, when someone gives an oral response to a tweet on camera, there is no subtitle under their soundbite. Do you want to respond to that, Bill?
No, I mean, it's a very, very good point. It's a very touchy matter. I've seen that criticism many times that, you know, the tweets get a double hit. They get around the world and to 50 million followers, and then they get broadcast to millions more here at home. So, and there is no effective response. There is
Okay,
no.
well, so what I would share that, I agree. I mean, I think it's a very interesting point. We have something from Catherine asking, can we trust the news sources that label articles as opinion or analysis? She tends to like the fact that some news sources do this kind of labeling. And again, I'd like feedback, Bill.
Yeah, so well, it depends on the source, but generally speaking, you should be able to. I mean, if it's a major publication or major website, then they have a reputation riding on it. If it's not, then you got to be doubly suspicious anyway. But they have skin in the game, so if they claim that they're doing it, they better be doing it. Lynn, I'm not hearing.
Okay, yeah, now you will. Sorry, I thought I hit on mute, but it didn't quite work. I think that's a fair comment. So Gregory writes that several professions have enforceable codes of ethics, law, medicine, etc. And I will add that social workers have a code of ethics. Why doesn't journalism have those? Are there First Amendment issues with that?
Journalism does have a code of ethics, which the Society for Professional Journalists is happy to display on its website. You can go find it, but it doesn't have the same force that it does for a profession that is regulated. You have to have a license to do social work or medicine, or you don't have to have a license to do journalism, as we now see. Anybody can, and they do.
So
I guess you could call it aspirational, but it does exist.
gotcha. So it's not followed as closely as perhaps some of us have to be. So Anita writes that Bill's comments on the post, when Trump says things that are demonstrably false, isn't it the job of a responsible newspaper to point that out? And I guess what she's asking about is the fact that you said the post was biased. I don't know if you want to respond to this, if it was referring to their Pinocchio character.
I'm not really saying the Post itself is biased. The Post has a point of view in its editorial columns. Its news columns generally tend to reflect the difficulties of this administration. But I don't think it's biased in the sense that the whole paper is pulling against the president. I think they do a pretty good job of being straightforward, presenting the news. But I'm sorry, what was the rest of the question?
So the rest of the question was, wait 1 second, let me just see. Oh, it says, when Trump says things that are demonstrably false, isn't it the job of a responsible newspaper to point that out?
In fact, they do. They have the fact checker, which is the source of that 20,000 lies from the beginning of the administration until mid-July. In fact, they research everything he says, and they rate it according to whether it is outright false or half true, or just a misrepresentation of the facts.
Yes, but I'm going beyond that. I heard you criticized the Post for saying that they pointed out when he was wrong about things. I read the fact checker, but almost no one else does. When he lies on major issues, like the virus or anything else that he lies about, what I heard you say is that it wasn't the job of the Post to point that out in a news article. And I've always thought it was.
I agree with you, it is. And if that's what I seem to say, I didn't mean to. In the
And maybe I heard you incorrectly then.
Post, in fact, has pointed out often when the president does lie or misrepresent, and has done that in the news columns as well as the fact checker. So no, I didn't accuse them of that, or certainly didn't mean to. However, it came out.
So we have another comment. It says, these days there seem to be multiple reporter bylines on almost every newspaper story. Are reporters now working in teams? Are they in effect fact-checking each other as a story evolves? Or is this an example of a decision by a committee on what is the truth? Good question.
Well, I mean, the stories all go through an editor. And I would presume that each of the writers brings some of the facts to the story. And one of them probably writes it all together. But then the story will go, and this is true for broadcast as well as print, the story will go to an editor who will look at it. And it will be fact-checked again, so that it should be caught in the editing process, if not before. But I don't, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, is it more unusual for there to be multiple bylines? I think is really what the question is dealing with.
It's become very usual. Partly because the news flow is so fast and so overwhelming on a 24-hour basis that it's impossible almost for one person to gather the material for a story. I mean, all major news organizations now have more people covering the White House than they used to. When I was there, each of the networks had 2 people, maybe 3, maybe 3 if they had a cable network. Now they have 5 or 6. The same thing for the papers, because you can't work 24 hours a day.
Right. And so we have a question from Owen. How do you deal with stories that stem from anonymous sources, and how do you check on them? And I think he's referring to you sending us to Snopes or something like that.
Well, no, I mean, there's a lot of debate, and has been forever, about the use of anonymous sources. For example, the Associated Press does not allow the use of anonymous sources, except in a very rare instance where the story is so big and depends on it that they have to. It's a rule, it's in their style book. They don't allow it. Most major news organizations claim not to want to do it, but the only way that you get a lot of information is if you promise to protect the identity of the people who tell it to you. So it's a catch-22. If you don't promise anonymity, you can't use it. So it does get used. And whether it is used responsibly depends on the reporter and the news organization. So that's where your own sense of trust comes in. If you don't trust the Post or the Times or whatever, then you may not want to believe this story that is backed up only by an anonymous source. But if you do, then you're more likely to trust.
Thank you. So Carol Kelly wants you to know it was a wonderful presentation. She asks, if you were starting your career today, are there different steps you would need to pursue to be successful than you did in the past with your career?
Absolutely, yes. I would have to be, well, of course I would be, because I'd be a lot younger. I'd have to be literate in all of the social media and a regular user of all of them, because this is now part of the job. You're expected to tweet because it builds the brand. You're expected to communicate instantly on Instagram, and all of this is now part of the job. So, yeah, things would be different. You would still, however, have to learn what journalism is supposed to be and how it is supposed to be practiced.
Thank you. So the next question is from one of my colleagues, Seal Jarrett from At Home in Alexandria. I also want to welcome the many other villages that are joining us tonight. I know you're here from DuPont and Foggy Bottom and kind of all around the Beltway, which is fabulous. So
Yes,
Seal
thank
asked,
you for joining us.
yeah, it's great. So Seal asked, Bill, you have a broadcast background. Can you address the fact that broadcast, cable, and public broadcasting must abide by different sets of FCC guidelines?
Yes. Until the late 80s, there was something called the Fairness Doctrine. Reagan administration managed to get rid of it, but it provided that you had to treat everybody the same way. Now you don't. But there are still constraints on broadcasters who use the public airwaves, which do not apply to cable broadcasters who use commercial private paths. Public broadcasting is a horse of a really different color. It gets some public funding, a lot of private funding from institutions and from individuals. The rules are slightly different in each place. There are things you can do on cable that you could never get away with in public broadcasting or over any over-the-air broadcast. Things that you can't today. But it's a bit confusing. But the idea was always it started out to be to protect people from offensive language. And it's still applies. The network still must abide by it. Go ahead. I can see that you're about ready to ask it. Go ahead. I can see you.
Oh, me? Oh, well, I find it interesting that when I point out to friends that cable news networks, and they can get away with things that broadcast networks and also public media cannot get away with, they don't think of media outlets in one bucket or another. They just think they're all in there together. And I feel like it's an important distinction to make, that there is an editorial standard to some degree, I thought there still was, between those different types of news outlets. Thank you.
Well, the cable networks are all about getting viewers, by getting what they call eyeballs. So they will put up a panel of people who disagree with one another. You know, I'm a conservative, you're a liberal, and by golly, we're going to argue about it, and it's going to get kind of mean, because that's what people will latch onto that. It's it's bait, clickbait they call it, and yeah, the cable networks do that a lot. It never used to be. It would be allowed on broadcast television, but they don't do it. And they don't do it for a different reason. Broadcast television has sponsors, not that they don't want to offend. Cable television has sponsors too, but they're more about getting carried and watched.
So we have a question from one of our members. Dottie asks, what will it take to get people to once again to agree more or less on the quote unquote facts? Or are we fated to remain divided into the foreseeable future? You have a crystal ball, Bill?
Unfortunately, mine isn't working. But here's the thing. As long as there is a substantial portion of the nation which feels left out, feels apart from the decision-making of what are perceived to be the coastal elites, there will be division. The only thing which is likely to pull people together is a major calamity, and that hasn't happened with COVID, but it would, for example, if we were attacked again. then that would probably override everything else. But you can see what's happened with COVID. That hasn't done it. People still believe or don't believe based on what they want to believe. And the only way for either party to bring people closer together is to try to reach out to the people it does not now have. For the Democrats to find a way to reach the people who are used to be their base, factory workers and middle-class people. For the Republicans to reach small business and people, also small factory workers and the middle class, instead of just the financial elite. Sorry. So until that happens, there's going to continue to be division.
Makes sense, unfortunately. So Barbara Hall wanted me to ask, Ed Murrow tells us the truth. Where do you go for the truth, and where do you suggest we go?
Well, look, I read a number of industry blogs every day. I read Politico, I read Axios, I read the Wall Street Journal, the Times, and the Post, the newspaper versions every day. There's always a pile of newspapers at the kitchen counter that my wife wants me to move and get rid of. I don't blame her, they're a mess. But I mean, I sample everything that I can, and then decide what it is that I think is important and not important. I mean, if I have a pile of unread papers, I'll jump to the opinion pages, see what's there, the editorial pages, get an idea of what's on everybody's mind. I keep up with the news online every day during the day. You might think that now that I'm retired, I wouldn't bother, but I still do. What I don't do is watch cable television because it drives me crazy. But so there you have it.
Thank you. We have another question. It says, what is the journalist's code of conduct when it comes to a fellow colleague from a different news organization being harangued or insulted by the president or his press secretary? Nobody seems to defend their fellow journalist or call out the unprofessional, unbecoming behavior on the part of the person at the podium. Didn't Ms. McAnevey promise never to lie to the media? I guess I don't see much professional solidarity among the reporting community. Is that an accurate impression?
Well, look, I mean, I immediately think back to several incidents. I think Sarah Sanders was still the spokesperson at the White House when people in various news organizations stood up and did follow-ups to back up Jim Acosta of CNN, who was being harangued by her or by the president. So I've seen that happen, exactly what the questioner is asking about. I haven't seen it happen lately, but I know that it has in the past more than once. There is a certain, I mean, when you work together with people on a regular basis, there's a certain commonality, there's a certain camaraderie, which, despite your professional differences, despite the fact that you work for competing news organizations, we travel together, or we used to. You work together every day, so people do look out for one another, even when they're trying to get a scoop over somebody else.
So, Bill, going back to the New York Times, Jeff Merrick wants to know, do you think they should have published Tom Cotton's op-ed and put a side-by-side on the other side? And how far has cancel culture impacted the role of both reporters and opinion writers in terms of a free flow of the charged opinions?
Well, it's an interesting question. I touched on it, but didn't go deeper because it is so fraught. And look, the Times, I think the Times should have published Cotton's op-ed and simply written something alongside it or above it, explaining how they felt about it and correcting any misstatement. I'm told there was a misstatement in it. I can't remember what it was. The fact that it led to the firing of the op-ed page editor, who happens to be a friend of mine, so I'm not altogether credible on this, I think is ridiculous. But that is what Barry Weiss was complaining about when she resigned. The idea that there are lines which cannot be crossed. I don't think that should be the case. But there are people who obviously feel differently. I mean, there were people at the Times who felt, particularly younger Black people, who felt that this put them at danger, at risk of this. And so you have to take that into account. The whole cancel culture is not really new. People have been trying to ignore or shut out those they don't like forever. But you can now do it. You can now do it online. You can now make it. You can now make it affect a whole group of people who follow you or with you. I understand it, but I don't like it.
I think that's pretty fair. So, looks like Liz has a question for you. Liz, do you want to unmute so you can ask your question? We can't hear you. I think okay, Liz, I lost you. Yeah, I still can't hear you. I think you're still muted. And then I see Diane has a question next. Liz, you're still muted. I'm going to go to Diane. Diane, I see you've unmuted, so we're going to start with you, and Liz, you can work on that. Diane?
Thank you. Bill, you answered part of my question when you mentioned the role of the editor who looks over the articles that are presented to him. So my question to follow on that is, if we have editors looking over the articles before they go forward, why are they not checking them? Why are they not checking them for bias?
They should be. They should be checking them for bias. And that's part of the editing process. I mean, if you're editing a news story, then you don't want bias in it. I mean, you need to edit it out if it's there. So
well,
yeah,
you said many young reporters do put their opinion into things more than you all used to do. So I'm wondering why there's nobody there catching that.
well, it depends, I guess, on their definition of bias. There's more opinion than I would like to see in some news columns. Not everyone, but more than I would like to see.
I agree with you.
But then look, I'm just an old guy, retired. My opinion doesn't matter.
I'm retired too.
Lynn?
Liz is now unmuted. Liz?
I'm unmuted. I couldn't figure out how to do the chat. Anyhow, Bill, I think it's right, as you point out, that the press and administrations and presidents have had problems in the past. One only has to think of the Pentagon Papers and what happened, with the Post and the dangers to the reporters, etc. On the other hand, it seems to me that there is a qualitative as well as a quantitative difference now, in that there is no attempt by this president, and really a lot of people in the administration, a lot of top officials, to do things in secret. I mean, they're open about the lies. They're open about attempts to destroy institutions of government. And it seems to me it's reached kind of a different dimension. And I don't know, I am proud of reporters like Yamiche Alcindor, who stands in the press briefing room and listens to all of it and doesn't just come right out and say, oh my God, at the top of her lungs sometimes. So I think they have a challenge now that's very different. And the other difference is there seems to be, because of the divisions that you discussed, and maybe that's the only way to get the divisions pulled back together, as you suggest, but because there's such widespread acceptance of lies and of attempts to undermine basic institutions of government. I don't know if you've got any particular insight as to how this all plays out, and whether you think I'm right that the situation really has reached a different level of crisis.
Well, Liz, I think the way you put it, a new dimension, is absolutely accurate. I mean, it is on a scale that we have never seen before. It is a danger to the republic because the normal institutions of government are being ignored and cast aside on a regular basis. Now, we still have a judiciary system. We still have a Congress. I don't think we're in any danger of, any immediate danger of becoming, a fascist country. But these are, there are very concerning trends afoot. You're right. I mean, and I know you are somebody who values the government because you were with it for a very long time. And I understand how you must feel. I do too. It is unheard of what is going on.
But Congress is not being, is barely able to do its job. Thank God for Nancy Pelosi. But I mean, this is my bias. But it's frightening, and it presents new challenges for reporters. I mean, how do they keep their heads in all of this?
It does, absolutely. And as I said, the beat is harder than ever to cover. News organizations have more people than ever covering it, and they're telling us what's going on, in spite of the fact that the White House insists often that it is something else. So, Lynn, we're about done, aren't we?
So I was about to say thank you, Bill. I promised 6:30. I lied to you. It's 6:33. But we will be cutting the program. I thank you for joining us, and I particularly thank Bill for a fabulous presentation. As I mentioned, this will be on our website, so please feel free to share this with your friends. I think it's a very valuable presentation. Bill, I hope you have speaker view or a gallery view so you can see the applauding, but people are thanking you, and I join in their thanks. I invite you all to join us for our next presentation on September 16th, when Alexandra Armstrong and Mary Donahue will be presenting on your next chapter for those who have recently retired and where we go next. And I know at this time, many of us are wondering that. So I hope to see you again, and I thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.